And the floor is yours again.
Yeah. The paper. Yeah, review of the use of AI techniques in serious games, decision making and machine learning. Had two topics: decision making and machine learning. Yeah, the review goal. The main goal of this paper is to collect all the relevant articles published during recent year and create a trend analysis about the use of certain artificial intelligence algorithms related to decision making and machine learning in the field of serious games. The method: they collect the data by searching, use different databases, different search terms. They admit that that might be they might miss papers because of that, but that's quite common when you do reviews like that. And they had the data analysis by extracting and coding. One of the code was the AI flagship, with the player experience modeling, procedural content generation, and game data mining. Those were the 3 points, and the player experience had some underlying points as well. And then the AI usage. Most paper on decision was on decision tree. In the machine learning, it was a balance between bias classifiers, artificial neural intelligence, and case-based reasoning algorithms. In the AI flagship, 65% of player experience modeling used player experience modeling with the gameplay as focus. The AI users, most common implementation were altering game flow or for assessing, classifying user state and behavior while playing. Yeah, criticism. Part of the decision-making chapter and machine learning chapter was just repeating what the table said. There was a lot of repeating what the table said. It provided no extra information, and everything was already explained. There was a lot of it. Publishing year was included in the table, but it was never like used. It never like said that which one was predominantly in the early years and which one was in the later years. Something they could have mentioned. Yeah, I think that's all I have about.
Cool. Yeah. So that's all. Okay. So impressions. Anyone?
Well, I agree about the criticism at least.
Specifically or comprehensively?
Like the repeated data. It's just, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 pages.
Yeah.
I think it's 12 pages.
12 pages.
It's a review paper, so that's the pain of it. That's right. Anyone else? Any viewpoints you want to share?
Yeah, I feel like they could have compressed it, like in my paper last week, where they put the tables in a different document and then referred to it.
That is still specific to
instead of repeating what the table says and point for point what the point is about and stuff like that, maybe try to discuss it a bit.
Very nice. Okay, yeah. Good point.
Yeah, it's like this is certainly a valid methodology of doing things and writing papers, but it was very tiresome getting through it. And I mean, like the data or the feeling is perhaps necessary, but just by reading the conclusion you kind of get the gist of it, where they summarize it as a whole. And as Maciek said, that some of this might not be interesting to everybody other than the conclusion, and then most of this could be in an appendix, kind of like, yeah, I don't know.
What did you learn from the paper? Like beyond the paper, not that you don't like the paper, but what did you learn from it? Did you learn anything from this? Was there anything insightful that you would take away if you were to design a sales game?
Yeah, not really, no. It was...
Okay.
There was no like insight in... They just says who does it. It doesn't say if it's successful, if it's helpful in any way. They just say, oh, these papers here does this, these papers here does that. So I mean, I guess I would consider like decision trees if I was going to have decisions, but
Yeah.
I already knew that. So yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah.
There is a certain bias in there. Yes.
They state that education and health markets were the most common
Mhm.
in the reviewed cases,
Mhm.
which might say something about the market and AI inclusion in serious games. They also state that, as you said, the most common implementation was doing some modification or altercation during during the playtime, and that might either reveal best practice in the field or untouched areas where serious games or AI might have something to do in serious games.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other points?
I would consider using the tables exclusively if I was supposed to make a serious game to see what different technologies and types of techniques and stuff existed and were used. So if I wanted to make a generic like normal serious game, I would use decision trees since they are used the most. Or maybe I would consider using something that wasn't so much used.
Yeah.
If I wanted to research whether or not it may be good for this case.
Yeah.
Because it might show like there were only 6 papers that did this.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe in my field it would be relevant.
Yeah. That sounds sensible. Yeah. So, other views?
I feel like it's really only a review paper, like they review and that's it.
That's it, right? Yeah.
They don't give any additional point.
Yeah.
They say that's
Yeah.
what's happening.
Yeah. That's it, right?
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
But is it usual for papers to have the conclusion that's a tenth of the length of the paper?
Again, sorry. What?
Like in this paper, or like
Yeah.
discussion and conclusion.
Discussion conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah.
You think you find it too long?
I'm surprised to see it
Yeah.
being that long. But well, because it's discussion and conclusion.
Yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, that sounds.
Yeah, it was.
I see what you mean. Well,
That was complete. Like the discussion is complete. They
Mhm.
discussed what they found.
So, yeah, I'd say I think you share a good impression here in many respects of the paper. So, of course, part of the reason you're subjected to that paper, so is that I wanted to see AI somewhat in the discussion. You probably figured that, right? But looking at the paper itself, there's 2 benefits that I would see from review papers like this. Number one, you kind of know what's happening. This is good for opening your horizon a bit in a way, right? So saying, okay, if I want to develop serious game, I would use serious games. But here you can at least see evidence, okay, what other techniques could work, right? So if you want to do a prototyping exercise, want to see what I could use, I at least get a direction into what I can use, as opposed to being out there and say AI, whatever, right? So here's it's kind of guided because you know, well, case-based reasoning actually works, particularly in the context of health games, right? Why does it work in context of health games? Case-based reasoning? Who talked about a paper related to health? Oh, why does case-based reasoning work there? Well.
Because it makes it relative to the real world and their real situation.
It's totally aligned with the finding diagnosis, right, of physicians and so on, because they apply that all the time, right? Case-based reasoning, they work based on experience and generalized knowledge, and then again abduct and identify the individual case. So that could give you direction. If you do health, well, don't only look at decision trees. Perhaps case-based reasoning may be the angle to go, right? Because the complexity of data may be so high that decision trees are not really feasible anymore, right? So it just expands too much. So that's one of the things. So this is one of the aspects, the advantage you can get. One of the things that I was surprised on, okay, we need to put it in perspective, it was different times here, but it says something about the entire field of serious games, for me at least, in the discussion. It says testing procedure. Only about half of all articles included in this review did perform some kind of user test.
It's weird.
Literally half of serious games that are developed that are embedded, ideally, in a domain of application, actually are tested. Right? They just develop games, put them out there, and that's it. Right? So, and that is says something about the discipline, I think, because that should never happen. I mean, I don't know what your
Well,
viewpoints are.
The problem is probably the commercial sector.
True, that could be.
Like in academia, we would want to test it, but in the commercial sector, you want to sell it.
So,
And if you test it and it's bad, then you have wasted money. And if you publish the paper, then you're definitely going to sell it.
but yes, I
Yeah.
agree.
But you kind of like, you don't test it like in public, like you test it internally. And
Yeah.
then
But wouldn't you still report about it, even if you test it internally?
depends on how good the report is. Maybe it's trade secrets.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
So there is here the well, one direction to actually assess that claim is also a claim, right? Would be actually to look into the reviews, right? Sorry, into the reference section. And my claim here is that probably the dominating fraction of papers here are actually academic papers. So I think it says something about academia because certainly it needs to be reviewed. There are some technical reports that are more company based, but most of them are in some sort of academic venues. So I still think that a lot of people just put serious games out there and they don't test and just describe how they did it. Right. So, but it's something to be reviewed. At least I think it says something about the practice and something direction that should be taken. A serious game without validation doesn't have any value. It tells me, okay, what did I do? That's a tech report at best, right? So, I mean, at least that would be an impression that I get. So I'm a bit disappointed on that ground. So, anything that's good about the paper?
It's extensive. It's extensive.
if
so
not,
they
it's
have
also
It's
been
a
thorough.
review.
Right.
It
Yeah.
says so in the title.
So if you were to do a review yourself, and that's why this paper is in this as part of this exercise here, what would you take away from it? Because you guys will in 1 year start writing a master's, and less 1 year do actually your project planning. So as part of this, you need to do a literature background, analysis and stuff like this. And this is a candidate for that, right? So because it doesn't provide any contribution but to review literature, right? Is there anything in there methodologically or otherwise that you could take away from it? What you think they did kind of okay?
Yeah, well, what I think was like the different categories.
Mm-hmm.
They made categories, explain what categories were, and then
Mm-hmm.
placed the different, inside those categories.
Yeah.
So you get like an easy overview of all the different papers.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I liked how they explained their data collection kind of process, and also how they selected papers based on abstracts and excluded papers based on some metrics. So like they, that's kind of one of the main things about doing or finding papers is jumping into the ocean of different stuff and being able to exclude and select papers.
Yeah.
And also the coding of it, like what kind of parameters were they looking for?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, have you done systematic lit reviews already? Anyone? I think it's actually, from an outline point of view, it's a really good description of the process, right? So I get to some flaws, but fundamentally, that's kind of how you want to think about your lit review next year. Where do you look stuff up, right? Find the relevant databases. What do you look for? Purely syntactical, keyword based. And then how to reduce the selection, right? So you can constrain by time, for example. You can constrain by relevance, so kind of a relevance filter, right? Basically figure out if is there serious games and the corresponding tech or whatever else in the abstract. If not, out again, right? So because you need to automate stuff, right? So, but the key thing about this, it needs to be systematic, right? Even if the process is flawed, that's fine, as long as it's systematic. That's academia, right? So, because you can challenge it and can fix it next time round, but it needs to be reproducible in the first place, right? So, from that point of view, that's actually quite healthy if we talk about data collection. I agree with you. Are there any flaws in the data collection or a description of it? Is there anything you could do better? keyword search terms, perhaps? Anything there? Okay, let's start from the first one. So, the review was carried out using mainly search engine provided web of knowledge. However, searches were also carried out in other electronic databases, for instance, databases particularly related to education, computer science, technology, and health. Right? Here it leaves this slightly. I'm not quite convinced that this listing is exhaustive. So they say, well, we use databases related to blah 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 and list some of them, right? So the question is that comprehensive listing or is that a partial listing, right?
It's probably more partial, and that may be the reason why there is such a large amount of medical papers.
So yeah, so that there's a bias in there, right? So by focusing on the corresponding databases, but I'm challenging the claim that this is reproducible, because if they're missing one database that they used, then I lose reproducibility, right? So you want to be really clear, for this search we use those databases, done and dusted, right? So really clear, right? So that's number one. The second one, search terms. Anything there?
They had game and games in the search terms,
Okay.
which may include not serious games.
Yeah, Kristoffer?
It's a very broad.
Yeah. You want to have a broad filter at this stage, right? So that's the key, right? You think about it like a funnel, right? You start with something, okay, first of all, where are the resources? The resources are everything. It's kind of a universe of all papers, right? Then you do search on those ones, reduce it a bit, right? And so on. So that's okay. They can capture too broadly, that's fine. But what's another problem there? Or is there a problem?
I mean, it could kind of build on what you said about the databases. Like, this isn't a complete list, and the combination they used, and also the number of articles drawn from those kind of search queries. So in terms of reproducibility, you've just gotten a list of buzzwords, and they say they have used it in some kind of conjunction.
Spot on. They totally. So you have 2 points there. The one I'm coming back later is really good. Is actually having quantitative information about it. But what I'm thinking here, my problem with this one is, how did they combine those terms? Did they have one? They copy and paste it all in once, or did they have an AND combination, OR combination, exclusive AND? Whatever. They didn't describe the logical operators which you're using in search engines to operate it, right? So, or did they use it one at a time and aggregated the results? So they just tell those are the terms we used, but how they are precisely used for reproducibility is totally obscure, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's also worthwhile to look actually into the search engine and figure out, okay, what syntax do they support, right? So some of them may just do a full text search and don't have any support for logical operators because they're so outdated over there, right? So they would need to be more specific about it. So I think I get a bit of an impression that they kind of blow the reader away with the comprehensiveness of the keywords, but in this actually lose the essence of reproducibility, and actually, I would rather be happy to have a subset of those keywords rather than actually blowing it up, that wildly, but rather explain precisely how they did it. So I'm slightly, that was something I'm a bit concerned about. And then what Markus said is spot on. If you do the systematic kind of filtering, right, data collection, I hope the authors don't watch us on the street. Anyway, then say how much papers are left after each stage, right? First stage, okay, there's nothing there, right? So, but second stage, you could say, okay, how much relevant papers did I find in the ACM, how much in IEEE, how much in Biomed Central, and so on, right? So give us the field, right? And then going through the next filter, selection of papers for inclusion, how much do I lose there, right? Because I kind of want to see this funnel effect. That gives me a good indication how good their process is as well. Because if you suddenly lose nearly everything, you have 20 papers left, then you know there's something wrong in your filtering step, right? So it helps qualitatively assess your approach, but also giving more quantitative insights that we're kind of missing. But fundamentally, the direction is right. It's just very fuzzily specified, right? So I suspect that they're not necessarily technologists, those guys, right? They didn't think about this in absolute great detail, but did it more from a very high level point of view. But fundamentally, this is the kind of approach you can take yourself. So take up some of that one for your own lit review that you eventually will do, right? But critically apply it on your own part, right? So and provide a nice table with an overview how you filtered stuff. That always goes well with reviewers. Any other comments? Yeah. Yeah. So there was that one. In terms of the data analysis, was there anything that was sensible or valuable? They discuss two structuring concepts relevant to serious games. Which are those? And AI. And you listed them as well. One of them anyway.
The AI usage. The
Uh,
flagship.
That's right, the flagship, right? So that's something I'm not sure, I hadn't heard about this before. So for me that was new, that classification in the context of serious games. So sometimes it's quite cool because if you apply existing classification schemes onto the data, it helps structure even more, right? So you break it down to some extent. So here's really good differentiation, I guess, into player experience, procedural content, and then the exposed game data mining, right? And yeah, which one was turned out to be the least relevant?
The procedural content generation.
Was it? Okay.
Wasn't it?
Really? I may have misspotted that. Probably right. Yeah, you're probably right. No, I was impressed by the game data mining because there's only one paper mentioned. Kind of matching the characteristics.
At least in machine learning, there was 0% of those.
Right. Well, there's two studies were categorized as procedural content generation. One article was categorized as game data mining. Yeah. Well, that doesn't really matter, right? It's interesting there is if you find theory that is relevant in, whenever you write your stuff, kind of theoretical frameworks or previous structure or results of previous survey papers that come up with this kind of classification scheme, think if you can apply them, right? So to structure, this gives you another column in your table basically, right? So because you suddenly can, and then also see if you see patterns, for example, and you pointed to this before, is there a particular direction of those AI flagships that was in a particular time period, right? In the beginning, perhaps they maybe focused more on the player, then they switched to procedural content generation because CPU power was fast, and then as there were more games out, you could hypothesize that there's more game data mining, big data has a key word here, to analyze games, right? Unfortunately, they don't draw any of those conclusions, right? But it would give you grounds for correlating, making richer observations, right? And it kind of comes for free in a way. Because you just need to skim the paper and see, okay, what do they actually use AI for in this case, right? And that's relatively straightforward, right? You don't need to really dig into the details, the results, whatever. You just say, what does it fall into, right? So, so if you find any of those classifications for your own work in the future, think about this as well, right? So because you have those 120 or 300 papers, and now you're coming from millions of papers, and you're now at 300, you still need to break it down more, right? And then those concepts come helpful, right? So look at if you have those kind of meta models, frameworks, or how they call them, reference models, whatever else. If you find any of that one, think about if it applies to your work. So they kind of looked broadly into literature there, and then so then I basically just did what you guys said, putting a lot of tables out there and repeating the tables, right? So and here that's what Marcia. I always get the name wrong. Maciek. If what you said is they're largely descriptive, right? They just say what they said already anyway, right? They take tables and repeat all the percentages. Here you want to see what?
Description of what they found.
Explaining the data.
Yeah.
Explaining the data, right? So because you have the data already, right? So we can read, and you guys are good at reading tables, it seems. But it's probably would be really, really handy to actually, give us more. What does it mean, right? What does it actually tell us about the game? So drawing some sort of perhaps conclusions, but at least starting to explain the data to keep me interested. Because otherwise, section after section, I can just go over it because every section is disconnected from the previous one, right? So.
And I think which is really annoying is, and also kind of highlights that the authors ain't that tech savvy, is that they reviewed the last decade, so the last 10 years, and it was published in 2015 or something.
So it's a bit dated, yeah.
And in such a fast-growing kind of environment as technology is, not comparing or viewing the trend in terms of years of publication and the trend of AI and usage is kind of like it's an untapped resource, and that would, in my mind, be much more interesting than they repeating their data.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you, and you alluded as well. They didn't make use of that the years, right? Because they had it there. They had the aggregate numbers. They figured it out. They could have just run a correlation against the AI flagships or whatever else they found against any of the columns they categorized so effortfully, manually, because they really looked into it and did, is it what type? Is it development of framework? Is it online mobile? At least identify trends, right? And that would be really, really cool. The only way of doing this is looking at the years. Simple as that. So it's a missed opportunity. Absolutely, you guys said that. I agree with you. It's a bit of a so they stated the obvious, but they didn't draw interesting conclusions that would, tell us something about what has happened in the serious games industry or where it's headed, right? So we wouldn't know that, for example, support vector machine, would have been the things to go for in 2015, or case-based reasoning would be totally dominating, even though overall the decision trees are more decisive, but over time there would have been a move away from those ones towards other technologies or something like that. So it's a bit of a pity. They're missing out on an opportunity here and just doing their repetition thing. It's also, they're really quite literally stating one by one. They're very short paragraphs, mostly one sentence, and that's not really helping developing a discussion, right? So it's really like you disrupt your flow of thought, your train of thought. Each time you have something to say in a way, and that's not necessarily. Yeah. So. Yeah. So to some extent, sorry for forcing you to that paper, but it's important to think about those papers because you will need to read some of those for your own research, right? But when you do that, of course, look at them critically because sometimes it's easy to be impressed by numbers, right? So especially on paper, and you have large tables, you say, wow, cool, ground truth, right? So. But there can be a lot of flaws in methodology itself, and even worse, there can be a really lack of conclusions drawn. Bad review papers just say, well, here, this is what we did, this is what we found, and then summarize, but actually don't generate really new knowledge. And this nearly falls in this category. There are some trends they highlight, but I think they're missing an opportunity to create perhaps a different new classification scheme, or suggesting trends in the future or something like this, right? So they're missing out on a lot of opportunities here to actually have something to take away, so that anyone who's really interested looking at this paper in 2020 and see if they arrived, if their prognosis was correct, right? But there's nothing like this, so there's no need to kind of reflect on this paper in the future in any kind of way. But yeah, so the discussion is somewhat worthwhile, but only in the context of that very time, of course. Yeah. One thing that's also quite relevant for you guys, perhaps, is the characterization of publication types, right? So they have this different levels: Q1 to Q2, Q3, Q4. What does it relate to? Why do they do that? Anyone? Why do they differentiate by publication type?
Because they may have different requirements or standards. Publish.
Okay. What would that be?
So I think type 1 international journals with impact factor would be like the top level journals, maybe. And type 2 would be just the international journals that may not be necessarily the highest quality.
Yep. So your intuition is right? So general international journals with impact factor implies that the journals are out there for some time already. Meaning people have used them, and the impact factor is basically how frequently is your stuff cited if you publish something there, right? So it gives a vague indication of impact or relevance of that journal, right? Whereas a journal without impact factor could be just, young journals, for example, that haven't found visibility, may not be listed in relevant big databases in the widest sense, right? And where the quality is really hard to assess, also because their pre-review process is not really probably well known in a way, right? So, how is it internally managed? Is the editor trustworthy and so on? Because you guys can start with a journal tomorrow, right? You guys know that, right? So in principle, and so you could also claim that it's an international journal because there's at least some Norwegian, some French, and some Polish participants here, so that could be editors of the journal. So that's what they're guarding against in a way. So by having impact factor and having the ISS N number. That's right. So you kind of recognize publication channels in a way. The next one was conferences, workshops, and symposia. Yes, so that's it's usually an implication of ranking. Articles are often ranked higher, whereas sometimes you need to be careful with this one because the international conference, workshops, and symposia, especially in IT and CS, conferences are often ranked higher than journals. Because conferences, what's the difference conference and journals? Trade-offs.
Well, a conference talk could be much more less detailed and be more like, it's a different way to appeal to a live audience than it is to somebody sitting down with a journal with a coffee and reading it thorough. So you have more leeway in terms of methodology and what to present than other. And I would believe that kind of conference papers are condensed versions of full reports, which may exclude important things.
So you're kind of right. So the conference paper is oftentimes stuff that comes before publishing in a journal, right? So people often go along the lines, okay, we have a conference paper, it's accepted, we get some feedback from people in the audience, so actually you have live direct feedback, and then you make a journal out of it, which now it probably comes out 2 years later, right? So if you look at the beginning of the paper, oh no, you need to look on the homepage, sorry for that. It actually writes the submission process, right? This thing was submitted, when? Does anyone recall?
When 2017?
Manuscript was received in 2014.
2014, right? And
3 years.
I'm sorry?
It took 3 years to be published.
Yeah, I think that's multiple iterations of publication. I think the first version was accepted and published in 2015, and then there was an update in 2017. So there's a bit of a mild, but at least a year, right? So, and a year in IT or CS is kind of a lifetime, right? So I'm not sure what's your view there, right? By the time you get this stuff out, that was probably already outdated in 2015, right? So that's the thing about conferences. Usually it's very timely, right? So it's literally stuff that you're currently doing, you're talking about. That's why it's relatively highly rated in computer science conferences, and sometimes, again, higher than many journals. I would go as far as to say that the highest rated conferences are definitely more important than journals without impact factor, guaranteed, and probably more important than many journals even with impact factor. So this structuring also says something about disciplinary perspective of the authors, right? What they think is highly ranking somewhere may actually not be the case in another discipline, right? So because serious games is grounded in the domain of interest, whereas the game development bit, right, especially the tech part, is actually grounded in CS, right, which has slightly different principles. So we have conferences, then we have workshops. Difference workshop and conferences? What's the difference? Sorry?
I have no idea.
No.
So usually conferences, workshops are co-located with conferences, and the key difference is there that workshops often are not complete. So basically it's work in progress. Right? You have some ideas, you tried something out, you're halfway done, you want to talk about it. You can still publish that, but it's generally lower ranking because it's not complete. Whereas conference, you expect a complete piece of work, condensed but complete, and ready, but still warrants perhaps feedback, refinement, discussion, and so on. But workshops are more like, I have a good idea. Here's that's the approach I took. What do you think, right? So oftentimes also, as workshop implies, it's like a smaller group discussion. So you have like 20 odd people, right? So then they chip in and say, hey, you could do the following, or you could do this following, right? So it's a bit more like this. And symposia are kind of a bit different as well. They're usually closed groups with more discussion focus rather than presentation focus. Conferences are usually a 15 minutes presentation. Next. 5 minutes QA, next one. 15 minutes presentation, 5 minutes QA. There's no space for discussion. It's just clarification that you can achieve there, right, in conferences. And then chapters and books, that's grey literature in the sense that the pathways by which papers find their way in books is obscure and can be very high quality or rigid, but it can also be very loose, saying I want to author a book, I talked to Springer, and got the permission to do so, and now I want one of you provides a chapter each, right? So there may literally be no review process attached to it all.
Or self-published.
Or it's self-published, even better or worse.
Like the game programming pattern book.
That's right. So yes, so that may also be an option, right? So that's right. But this is probably more practitioner stuff, right? So based on experience, so it has a slightly different angle, right? So you can cite this in your work, but you need to be explicit. This is industry perspective, right? Whereas the academic perspective is, it can be, you know, worse than that, because there's at least experience behind it. But here it could just be basically nearly opinion pieces that could are condensed into some sort of book chapter. I'm not saying that it's always the case, right? So just saying that the probability with which this is happening is higher than compared to, for example, conferences, most likely, right? So if you have a good handbook or a good textbook, it can be very high, well-groomed, well-developed, and highly reviewed, right? So that's one of the key things there as well. Yeah, by the way, the review process in workshops is often not double-blind, meaning the reviewers know the author names. Whereas in journals, it's definitely usually double-blind, meaning the reviewer doesn't know about the authors, and the authors don't know about the reviewers. It's completely anonymous, right? So there's varying extents to this, which one is happening. That also says something about the quality of the venue, because it offers opportunity for collusion or bias, right? If you know this author already, I say, oh yeah, come on, let's give them a pass, right? So then you're probably different in terms of the review than if you're totally relying on the paper only, right? So that again is also reflected in rigidity. So fundamentally, I'm not saying they do things wrong, the order is roughly right, but they would need to accommodate some disciplinary difference. But it's good enough that they're stated. So this is quite valuable, because again, another column there on this one. Okay, a lot of talk from my side. Any thoughts? No? Right. So see it as a methodological insight, this whole thing, right? Not necessarily, wow, we need to learn this by heart, but just how you could approach it, what's good, what's not so good, right? And having richer synthesis at the end, where you actually construct and systematically discuss something, draw conclusions about, come up with your own meta model, you name it, or classification scheme. That's what I would want to see, even in master thesis. That you give me, what do I get from this? Why did you do this? Did you do that because you want to pass the masters, or fill up chapter 2? Or do I actually have something that's tractable for, reader, or even for your work that you're describing in chapter 3 onwards? Cool. Right, so that's that. Okay, any more questions or concerns regarding paper and or talk, of course? No? Oh, okay. Cool. Some feedback for your discussion. This paper, of course, for your report, you can take it apart if you want, of course, right? It's part of it. But it probably would be worthwhile to see if you find more recent reviews that would be worthwhile discussing, right? Because it's also working in a niche. It's serious games in AI. But you can also look if you find reviews on use of tech, stuff you talked about, in serious games, right? You can shift the focus from there, right? I just felt that we want to discuss that kind of paper first before, because technology is kind of nearly all of it, because if you want to talk about technology, you not only want to talk about HoloLens 2 or whatever else, you want to give an overview kind of thing, whereas other cases there's a bit more specific with the examples, I guess, because technology you want to learn the big picture. So and it's sometimes hard to get that. So you probably want to look into kind of a review paper level perspective as well for your report, right? But we can discuss that if you have some candidates in mind. Paper. So you're kind of in an odd spot here, because your specific paper is actually not that specific. Right. So, cool. All right.